The year is 1300. You stand on a dirt road that cuts through a valley controlled by a man you've never met. His banners hang from a wooden tower in the distance, but it's the armed men at the crossroads who matter. They don't wear uniforms, they don't carry badges. Yet when they tell you to stop, you stop. When they demand a toll, you pay. There's no point arguing. There's no King's Patrol coming to help you. In this world, the people with weapons make the rules, and then everyone else learns to live with it. This was everyday life for most medieval Europeans. The state, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. There were no police departments, no centralized bureaucracy, and no system that monitored what every noble, sheriff, or official was doing. Authority was personal, not institutional, which meant anyone who held land and could gather a group of armed men had the power to control the people living on it. This is what made the medieval period such fertile ground for behavior that today we'd call organized crime. But back then, it wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was part of how society functioned. A baron didn't need approval to enforce his rules. He collected taxes, judged disputes, controlled trade, and commanded violence, and sometimes fairly, sometimes abusively. A reasonable lord could keep a region stable. A corrupt one could turn it into a private racket. Illegal tolls, forced payments, seized goods, and intimidation weren't necessarily seen as crimes. They were simply custom. The king only cared about loyalty, soldiers, and taxes. Everything else was left to the lord's discretion. This decentralized control allowed predatory behavior to flourish. Many nobles ran their territories like personal empires, shielded by the very titles that legitimized them. Travelers could be ransomed under vague accusations. Merchants could be forced to use a lord's markets and pay whatever he demanded. In extreme cases, nobles built private prisons, issued their own coins, or sheltered criminals who paid them a percentage of their loot. Most communities had no real ability to resist. Villages were isolated, roads were dangerous, and justice depended on oaths and personal relationships, not universal laws. If a man with 20 armed followers declared authority over a road, most people accepted it. Challenging him meant risking your life, your family, and your livelihood. The legal system made things even more complicated. Being declared an outlaw removed a person's rights entirely. Anyone could rob or kill them without consequence. This meant some outlaws formed gangs for survival, while powerful lords could weaponize outlawry to eliminate rivals or control troublesome subjects. At its core, medieval power operated in ways that looked uncannily like criminal networks today. Loyalty flowed upward. Payments moved upward. Protection came from above. Violence was used strategically. And those at the top maintained order through fear, reputation, and personal alliances. People in the Middle Ages recognized corruption. But with limited enforcement and almost no oversight, there was often nothing they could do about it. Some lords acted as genuine protectors, others as predators, and most occupied a gray area in between. But all of them operated within a system where unchecked authority blurred the line between governance and organized exploitation. This environment, fragmented, localized, and personal, is what allowed medieval organized crime not just to survive, but to thrive. The medieval countryside was vast, lightly governed, and often silent, the perfect environment for men who lived outside the law. Outlaw bands didn't appear suddenly or dramatically. They grew out of desperation, conflict, and opportunity. When authority was weak or corrupt, the roads became hunting grounds. These groups weren't the romantic rebels of popular culture. Most were small, mobile, and tightly organized. They knew the terrain better than anyone, relied on coded signals and safe houses, and learned which merchants were worth ransoming and which weren't. They thrived because the landscape worked in their favor. Picture this. You're walking a forest road at dusk, the light thinning through the trees. The quiet is absolute, until it isn't. A branch snaps behind you. Another ahead. By the time you realize what's happening, they're already there. 4 men stepping out of the undergrowth as if the woods themselves spat them out. No badges, no authority. But they control this road tonight. This is how medieval outlaw bands operated. Ambush, intimidation, and calculated risk. Their targets were rarely random. Merchants, clergy, tax collectors, and wealthy travelers were prime opportunities. Farmers weren't worth the trouble. Even when the gangs robbed, they often sought ransoms over violence. Killing a hostage ended profit, but returning one alive could bring multiple payments over a season. Outlaws formed alliances with corrupt officials, too. A sheriff might fail to patrol certain roads. A bailiff might warn a gang when a wealthy caravan was coming. Payment changed hands quietly. Everyone benefited except the victims. Some outlaw groups developed internal rules, shared spoils, roles within the gang, signals during ambushes, and agreements on which villages could be used for supplies. These weren't codes of honor. They were practical systems for survival. And in regions with thick forests or rugged hills, gangs could operate openly for months or years. The biggest reason these bands existed is the simplest. Enforcement was almost impossible. Medieval law relied on local manpower, and most communities didn't have enough armed men to chase gangs deep into the wild. Even when authorities organized a pursuit, outlaws vanished into terrain only they understood. To ordinary travelers, the landscape itself felt hostile. A quiet road could hide danger. A peaceful town could be paying protection money to keep gangs away. And every rumor of a nearby band changed how people moved, sticking to daylight, traveling in groups, avoiding certain paths entirely. Outlaw bands weren't the only criminals of the medieval world, but they were the ones who shaped how people felt, vulnerable, exposed, and alone on open roads where the nearest help might be a day's ride away. Power in the Middle Ages was supposed to flow downward from kings to nobles, and from nobles to the people they governed. In reality, many nobles discovered that the same authority that let them protect their lands also let them exploit them. And in regions with little oversight, a baron with a castle and a few dozen armed men could operate in ways that looked less like governance and more like organized crime. Unlike outlaw bands, noble predators didn't hide in forests. They operated openly from fortified estates, market towns, and river crossings. Their violence didn't come from ambushes, but from privilege. A noble could seize goods under the guise of inspection, impose sudden tolls on travelers, or detain someone for imaginary offenses. These weren't secret crimes. They were abuses of authority carried out in daylight. The most common method was the illegal toll. A noble who controlled a bridge, ford, or road could demand payment from anyone who passed. Technically, tolls required the king's permission. In practice, many nobles charged whatever they liked, doubling or tripling the cost during harvest, pilgrimage, or war. Since few travelers had the means to resist, the toll became a permanent, unchallenged source of income. Protection was another lucrative scheme. A noble might offer safety to merchants who passed through his land for a fee. Those who refused sometimes found themselves robbed soon after, usually by men suspiciously similar to the noble's own retainers. To ordinary people, the difference between a protection racket and legitimate security was almost impossible to see. Noble violence also extended to kidnapping for ransom. While outlaw kidnappings were risky and unrestrained, noble kidnappings were strategic. A baron might seize a wealthy merchant, minor lord, or rival official, then demand payment under the excuse of settling a debt or punishing an offense. The prisoner would be held in a fortress, treated harshly but not brutally, and released once money changed hands. The king often ignored these acts unless they targeted the wrong person. Some nobles went further, using their private armies to settle scores and intimidate neighbors. They raided rival estates, stole livestock, and levied unauthorized taxes on surrounding villages. Their retainers, professional fighters loyal to the lord rather than the crown, acted as enforcers, collecting payments, threatening dissenters, and controlling trade routes. These weren't street gangs. They were heavily armed crime syndicates disguised as political authority. Corruption played a major role. Sheriffs, judges, and local officials often depended on nobles for employment, protection, or status. A noble with influence could manipulate court cases, neutralize accusations, and declare opponents outlaws, stripping them of legal protection. With the right alliances, even violent wrongdoing became untouchable. The effect on local communities was profound. People lived under laws that changed depending on who enforced them. A fair noble could maintain stability. A predatory one could destroy livelihoods. Villagers paid rents, tithes, tolls, and fees that flowed upward to a man who might be more criminal than the outlaws hiding in the hills. This created a world where ordinary people sometimes feared nobles more than bandits. A bandit might rob you once. A noble could squeeze you for years without ever breaking a single official rule. And because his authority came from his title, not his behavior, few had the power to stop him. In regions filled with competing lords, this produced constant tension, a landscape ruled not just by hierarchy, but by personal ambition, intimidation, and overlapping claims to power. The medieval noble who turned predatory wasn't acting like a criminal. He was acting like a ruler whose authority had no limit. Medieval cities looked impressive at a distance. Stone walls, busy markets, and crowds of people. But inside those walls was a world where poverty, profit, and opportunity mixed in ways that created a different kind of organized crime. Unlike the outlaw bands of the countryside or the predatory nobles in their castles, urban criminals didn't need forests or fortresses. They needed anonymity. And medieval cities provided exactly that. Crime grew naturally in places where crowds gathered. Markets, docks, taverns, and narrow back alleys offered perfect conditions for thieves, fences, and smugglers. The city watch existed, but it was small, poorly equipped, and often corrupt. Most watchmen were local residents who knew the criminals personally, sometimes too personally. Fines could be reduced, patrols could be skipped, and evidence could disappear with the right payment. Much of urban crime was based on networks rather than gangs. Pickpockets worked in pairs or trios, sharing signals to distract victims. A thief might hand a stolen purse to a runner, who passed it to a fence, who sold it to a merchant. The original thief might never see the final profit, but the system kept everyone protected. Roles were clear, and the risk was distributed. At night, a medieval city felt completely different. The noise softened, the air thickened with smoke and damp stone, and every shadow seemed to hold someone waiting for their chance. Smuggling was another major trade. Goods entering a city were taxed at the gates, so criminals made fortunes by sneaking products through drains, back entrances, or weak points in the wall. Food, wine, cloth, spices, and even weapons passed through these hidden routes. Corrupt gatekeepers sometimes turned a blind eye or handled the operation themselves. Cities also had protection rackets. A group might offer security to market stalls, taverns, or workshops for a weekly fee. Refusal meant harassment, broken goods, or sudden trouble with local officials. Because the rackets were tied into the city's informal power structure, reporting them could be dangerous or pointless. Women played roles in city crime too, often as information brokers, pickpocket accomplices, or operators of unofficial lodging houses used by criminals. Some tavern owners provided rooms for smugglers or arranged discreet meetings between buyers and thieves. Their establishments became part of the urban underworld, known as safe places where deals could be made. Crime was also influenced by guilds. While many guilds were honest associations of workers, some used their influence to control prices, restrict trade, or pressure rivals out of business. A guild with enough power could behave like a legalized cartel, dominating an entire industry through intimidation and regulation that favored their members. The overcrowded living conditions made everything worse. Narrow streets, poor lighting, and tightly packed buildings gave criminals dozens of escape routes. A thief could vanish into a crowd or disappear through a shop entrance without being noticed. The city's design itself worked in favor of those who knew its hidden corners. Justice inside a city was inconsistent. Courts were busy, evidence was weak, and punishments often fell on whoever couldn't pay the appropriate bribe. Many criminals avoided consequences simply because magistrates didn't have the resources to investigate every offense. This created an environment where crime became a part of daily life, expected, tolerated, and sometimes secretly encouraged. Urban crime didn't usually involve large armies or dramatic raids. It was quieter, more organized, rooted in the rhythms of city life. It operated through networks, relationships, and opportunities that changed with the markets and seasons. While nobles and outlaws dominated the countryside, the city had its own predators, hidden in plain sight. Medieval crime didn't survive because it was hidden or clever. It survived because the world around it made it almost impossible to eliminate. The systems that allowed lords, outlaws, and city networks to operate weren't accidents. They were built into medieval society, reinforced by culture, geography, and the limits of government power. Imagine living in a world where news traveled slower than a man on foot, and any danger beyond the next hill could go unchallenged for months. The first problem was simple: enforcement. Kings had authority in theory, but in practice they lacked the money, manpower, and infrastructure to control every village, forest, and street. To ordinary people, the idea of a central government capable of protecting them was almost unimaginable. A king might rule a kingdom, but he didn't rule the countryside, not directly. And when crimes occurred far from his reach, the victims often had no one to turn to except the very people exploiting them. The second issue was geography. Europe was full of forests, marshes, mountains, and rivers that broke regions into isolated pockets. This made communication slow, travel dangerous, and coordination nearly impossible. Criminals thrived in these gaps. The more scattered the communities, the easier it was for outlaws, corrupt nobles, or urban networks to carve out their own spaces. Weak communication meant authorities never gained a clear picture of what was happening. Reports were inconsistent, delayed, or distorted. By the time a king heard of an outlaw group or predatory lord, the situation might have changed entirely or faded into local legend. The third factor was economic. Crime was profitable, and many parts of medieval society quietly depended on it. Some merchants paid protection money because it was cheaper than losing cargo. Some officials accepted bribes because their wages were too low to live on. Even peasants sometimes helped outlaws, providing food or information in exchange for small favors or a share of the loot. Criminal networks didn't survive in isolation. They survived because they fit into the economic realities of the time. The legal system also played a role. Courts relied on community testimony, oaths, and reputation. Without written records or organized investigation, it was easy for criminals to manipulate outcomes. Powerful nobles could influence trials. Outlaws could hide behind alliances or vanish into other jurisdictions. City networks could operate quietly inside overcrowded districts that no one wanted to police too closely. Finally, social attitudes shaped the landscape. Medieval people accepted a level of violence, exploitation, and corruption as normal parts of life. A noble demanding harsh tolls wasn't seen as a criminal. He was seen as a bad lord. A pickpocket wasn't a threat to society, he was a nuisance. Even outlaw gangs were sometimes romanticized or tolerated if they targeted the wealthy or the unpopular. All of this created a world where crime persisted, not because it was stronger than the law, but because the law wasn't strong enough to make a consistent difference. When authority is local, communication slow, and justice uneven, organized crime becomes part of the fabric of life rather than an enemy to be eradicated. By the end of the Middle Ages, new systems, growing towns, stronger monarchies, and improved administration began to challenge these old patterns. But for centuries, crime endured because medieval society itself almost guaranteed its survival.